Something like
Hello, welcome once again. I'm Imran Garda and you're in the stream. Today, Russia and race. How migrant laborers there are dealing with tough working conditions and growing ultra-nationalism. Our digital producer, Ahmed Shihabuddin, is here, as always, looking out for your feedback, and he's got a ton of feedback for all of you. Joining him on the couch is Central Asia analyst Erica Marat. She's also an adjunct professor at the American University. Welcome to the stream, Erica. Good to have you on the program. It's not often that we have somebody with your geographic and geopolitical expertise. Tell us a little bit about some of the work that you do.
Oh, I research a lot of issues in Central Asia, mostly political development, political change, some issues related to labor migration, to state-society relations in Central Asia, and I specifically focus on security issues, on security reform, and as it relates to political development and state-society relations in Central Asia.
And as we were talking about it off air, generally most of these countries in Central Asia locked in between seemingly more important countries that get the headlines more often.
Yes, that's true. Central Asia is located between Afghanistan, China, Russia, very important countries, very big countries, China and Russia. So a lot of attention goes to those countries, and Central Asia is seen as sort of addition to these countries as opposed to an independent region that deserves personal attention.
Yeah, intrigued to hear your thoughts on the issue of migrant laborers, particularly from Central Asia in Russia, and the broader issues related to race and perhaps xenophobia. Welcome once again to the program, Erica. Well, of course, this show is all about our community, so if you've got a story you want us to cover, you can share it with us on our Facebook page. And Ahmed has some feedback from those of you who've been feeding the stream.
So today for our feedback story, it comes from Busan, South Korea. Our online community started sharing it with us many, many months ago, and they've been updating us ever since. Now, for 309 days, former union worker Kim Jin-suk, who you can see right behind my screen, protested against mass layoffs by the Hanjin Heavy Industries and Construction Company from on top of a 35-meter high crane at the company's shipyard. Now, after more than 11 months of braving the cold and lack of food, Jin-suk finally came down from the crane after a deal was signed between the management and workers' union on Wednesday. Now, this story was sent to us from Twitter user LiveJ, and it documents some of Thursday's events at the shipyard. Now, this is one photo, and this photo shows the workers dressed in blue waiting for Jin-suk to step down from the crane. Now, his Storify also has this video in it, which we're going to play for you, which shows the moment she actually stepped down. Now, the agreement requires the Hanjin Shipping Company to reinstate 94 laid-off workers within a year and pay each of them $176,000. Now, Kim Jin-suk did not touch the ground since she started her sit-in on January 6th, more than 11 months ago. Now, she's currently in the hospital and faces a police investigation on charges of obstruction of business and trespassing. And the dispute at Hanjin began in December when the company had announced a plan to lay off 400 of its workers. Now, Jin-suk's sit-in has managed to capture the hearts and minds of thousands in Busan over the past 11 months, including famous actors and filmmakers who have since clashed with police in the streets of the city. Now, remember, you too can send your stories to us, but for now, here are some of the stories that we are following here at the stream.
Now, for poor people in Central Asia, Russia is often seen as the promised land, Workers from nations such as Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan flood into Russia seeking jobs and a way out of poverty. But some of them end up getting far more than they bargained for. Activists say migrants live and work in very poor conditions, and they're often exploited by employers and targeted by ultranationalists who blame them for stealing their jobs and polluting Russia's racial purity. That's something you'll hear quite often. Now, immigration is growing in Russia. There are an estimated 4 to 6 million migrant workers in that country, and that has led to a rash of deadly assaults against foreigners. Amateur footage has been circulating online, purportedly showing Russian skinheads beating up migrant laborers. Of course, we can't completely verify the authenticity of all of these videos, but such images add to a sense of fear and insecurity among those foreign workers. Well, joining us now via Skype is social anthropologist Madeleine Reeves. She studies transnational migration with special focus on Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Welcome to the stream, Madeleine. Good to have you on the program.
Thanks.
First of all, should we be separating the issues of migrant laborers and racism in Russia, or do these overlap to such an extent that they are almost one and the same?
The issues do certainly overlap, but I think it's useful to separate them out because the causes of each of those processes is quite separate, I think. Migrant labor from Central Asia to Russia is very much economically driven. As you mentioned in your opening segment, the economies of Central Asia have encountered really grave difficulties after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of collectivized agriculture. So a lot of people are going and working in Russia as a matter of economic survival. My own research suggests that about 4 in every 5 families in rural Kyrgyzstan depends directly or indirectly on remittances being sent back from Russia. And I think the issue of racism in Russia is certainly exacerbated by the visible presence of migrant workers, particularly in Russia's large cities. There's a kind of visible presence of migrant workers. But I think the roots of that are somehow quite different. There are historical roots, there are political reasons why nationalism has kind of gained ground in recent years that can't be attributed simply to the increase in the number of migrant workers.
In a broad sense, gauging public opinion in Russia, are these migrants needed but not wanted?
I think that's very well put. I think the Russian government, in a sense, faces a dilemma because the Russian population is decreasing quite dramatically. There's a demographic issue, and if you speak to Russian officials, they acknowledge that Russia needs migrant workers and that small businesses are eager to employ migrant workers. But on the other hand, I think that the general sentiment amongst the population of Russia is that their jobs are being undermined by migrant workers who are willing to do the same jobs often for much lower rates of pay, and that creates real antagonism at a local level. And I think a big part of the problem is that the labor market is highly unregulated. Most employees, most migrant workers, indeed most Russians are not given formal contracts. Most contracts are verbal, people can easily be laid off from work, and so the conditions in which people work are really very often very, very poor. And Russians can often feel that they're being undercut, that they're being laid off because employers can employ migrant workers more easily.
Madeleine and Erica, we often ask our audience to contribute their feedback via video as well as Twitter and Facebook. And we have a question coming from Chris Schwartz. You might know him. He is affiliated, works with Eurasia Net. So let's listen to his question. This is for you, Erica.
Hey guys, this is Chris Schwartz from Eurasia.net. Thank you very much for covering this topic. It's not often talked about in the Western press. Now, being as we are a digital journalism organization, we naturally want to know what is citizen media saying about this topic in Russia. Thanks, guys.
So what is citizen media saying about this, since often the mainstream media might not cover this?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you, Chris. Well, you can see how Russian online media is more diverse, and the social networking websites are really picking up. They're growing in numbers. So there is really a lot of different voices. There are voices that really support liberal opposition and opposition in general who chose to unify people along nationalism ideas, but there are also people who think that this is wrong and that it is important to develop ideas, habits of tolerance in Russia, and it's important to understand that migrants have difficult life. They're not in Russia to occupy Russia, but they're in Russia because of hard life.
Right.
And that government needs to come up with better policies. But of course, there are also lots of voices that support the idea that migrants are not wanted in Russia.
All right, fair enough. We have another question, Madeleine, for you from the other Rizman. You spoke a little bit about perhaps they're needed but not wanted, but he says, how strong are labor unions generally in Central Europe in general? Is organizing a realistic option? What do you make of that? Is it?
I think that's a really good question. So far, labor organizing has really been pretty limited, and that's not just amongst migrant workers, I would say. That's amongst employees in Russia more generally. I mean, the whole Soviet tradition of unions was quite different from that we know in the West. And there have been isolated instances of migrant workers donning tools and refusing to work in certain conditions because they haven't been given contracts or they haven't been paid. But more often, the situation is that migrant workers, in my experience, will put up with a great deal because there is very little formal organizing, and because even if they do organize, there's a great anxiety that they can just be laid off and somebody else will be taken in their place. And in fact, I think one of the dynamics that tends to be talked about very little is actually antagonism between different communities of migrant workers, between Uzbeks and Tajiks and Kyrgyz, because people tend to organize in labor brigades, mostly along lines of kinship and friendship and ethnicity. And sometimes there can be real competition, of a group of migrant workers of one ethnicity saying, you know what, we can do this construction job for less money, for instance.
Right.
So there tends to be as much, I would say, there doesn't tend to be much in the way of really mass collective action, and a great deal of fear because many migrant workers are working in situations of illegalized labor. I tend to prefer that term to talking about illegal or legal labor. That is to say, very often they're in situations where their labor is really precarious because it's not documented, or because people often don't know whether the documents that they have are authentic or fake.
Yeah,
so there's little organizing.
Yeah, you mentioned illegalized labor. You also did some good research on these underground towns. Very quickly, before we go back to Erica, tell us a little bit about these underground towns and the surprise that many Russians had upon the discovery of these towns.
Yeah, I mean, the Russian media tends to make a great deal of sort of lurid exposés of migrant workers who are found to be living in basements. There was one incident where some migrant workers were found, dozens and dozens of them living in a bunker that was supposed to be a secret object underneath a factory that was producing secret instruments. This reflects, I mean, although there's a great deal of kind of lurid reporting of this, and I think this really feeds into xenophobic feelings in Russia, what it reflects is an acute shortage of affordable accommodation. Moscow is one of the most expensive cities in the world, and yet migrant workers are being paid often salaries of perhaps $200 or $300 a month. So what happens is that one migrant worker will rent an apartment, or if they have the ability to do so, they will get hold of the basement of an apartment block, and they will sublet mattress space for usually in the realm of about $90 to $100 per month, which might still be half of a migrant worker's salary, but very often they'll be living then cheek by jowl, maybe 9 or 12 people in a room. In migrant apartments where I was doing research last year, in a 3-room apartment in Moscow, there'd typically be between 20 and 30 migrant workers.
Well, Russia's not the only place, and I've seen this with my own eyes in the Middle East, in Qatar and elsewhere. And just to piggyback on the point you made about xenophobia, there's a tweet from Zizo Zelaya where he says, the danger of nationalism is when the going gets tough, minorities are blamed for taking jobs and ruining the economy, i.e. Germany of the 1930s. So, some of our community identifying some of those universal themes related to migrants and others. Let's go back now to Erica. Erica, I know you wanted to come in with both a point and a question for Madeleine.
Sure. Regarding this latest tweet, it's absolutely correct because the problem is bigger and it's not just migrants, not just xenophobia. The young Russians especially, they're frustrated with their future, with the political stagnation. They can't find jobs. They feel like their jobs are being taken from them. So it's a bigger frustration of Russians about the economic conditions in Russia and about political future. They can't basically. There is no.
I'm listening to the question.
There is no future in Russia beyond. There is no predictable future in Russia beyond the next presidential election. So, and it's really uncertain how the presidential elections in March next year are going to take place and what is going to happen after that. But coming back to what Madeleine said, and I agree with everything what Madeleine has just said. I wonder what you think about the fact that a lot of migrants, they come from Central Asia or other former Soviet states to Moscow and to other big cities in Russia. They're not there really to stay forever, and therefore they don't really plan long term, and therefore they don't organize into some sort of labor unions, or they don't try to set up a nice house, a nice apartment for themselves. They're okay to
live day to day.
Exactly, live day to day and to share an apartment with 40 other people instead of spending more money on a better accommodation. Because they don't plan long term as well, and they're not there to stay.
Okay, Madeleine?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think the majority of migrant workers very much see home as back in Central Asia, and we must recognize that I'm speaking of Central Asia, but there are migrant workers from the Ukraine, from Moldova, from the Caucasus. This isn't just a Central Asian issue. But I think a lot of migrant workers would actually like to be able to invest in a future. I mean, I think what we're increasingly seeing is couples bringing over young children from Central Asia who would love to be able to enroll their child in school or in kindergarten, for instance, but simply can't. They can't either because there aren't the places or because they don't have the documents, the propiska, the kind of local residence registration that you need to be able to do that. So I think it's not just because migrant workers necessarily kind of see it as incredibly, their existence as temporary. I think it's also that they face kind of systemic structural barriers to being able to do so.
Yeah, and looking at just a general sense of racism in a broader sense, something I've called up here is even somebody who was successful and a hero of his football team, Lokomotiv Moscow, Peter Odemwingie, a Nigerian footballer, when he had decided to leave Lokomotiv, some of the fans had unfurled this banner at the stadium saying thanks West Brom and holding out and portraying a picture of a banana there. Yeah. And there were monkey chants that used to usually accompany Odemwingie playing and other African players as well in the Russian league. I mean, that suggests that it's not only those who are at the bottom of the economic ladder that tend to bear the brunt of some of this discrimination in Russia. And Ahmed, I know that on Facebook you've earmarked a few comments which also highlight people feeling this similar thing here as well.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to ask you, Madeleine. For example, Alexander Kuhn on Facebook says he used to live in Moscow during the 90s and early 2000s, living in the German community. We would receive congratulations for Hitler's birthday from hordes of neo-Nazis, he writes, each year that would pass by their gated community. He says he wasn't sure if they should laugh or cry. Now, you can only hope that's a rhetorical comment or question. But what do you make, I mean, of the actual climate on the ground? Is it a growing fear of xenophobia? Place it for us.
Yeah, I mean, that's the million-dollar question in a way. I mean, I think part of it has very deep roots, and although within the Soviet Union there was a discourse of internationalism, of this as a multi-ethnic state, there were also respects in which there was certainly a kind of a hierarchy of peoples, and that there was a good deal of kind of tolerated racism. So there's historical roots, but I think much of it has to do with simple ignorance. I think particularly as regards, say, African American students. Yeah.
You know, we have on Facebook Lorenzo de Tampa saying that it's not necessarily a thing of the past, which perhaps you're alluding to. He says Russia is slowly descending back towards that Soviet mentality, especially when Putin returns to full power. So is that true?
I mean, I think there's certainly new currents that are happening and shifts in the configuration of nationalist movements in Russia. And I think that in terms of a sort of popular sentiment, you know, there are monitoring organizations. There's the Levada Center that monitors kind of attitudes towards foreigners, and they suggest a fairly consistent and consistently negative attitude towards outsiders, and particularly dark-skinned outsiders. They do some kind of comparisons where they ask the question in their monitoring, would you tolerate the following person being a member of your family, being a neighbor, being a friend, being a colleague? And what comes out is that attitudes are consistently worse when that person is identified as being from the Caucasus, or is identified as being dark-skinned, or is identified as being Tajik. Indeed, in the latest survey from 2010, nearly 29% said that they wouldn't allow Tajiks into Russia at all, and only 1% said that they were willing to tolerate them as a close friend.
Those are harrowing statistics. Those are harrowing statistics, Madeleine. Erica, going back to the issue of the desperation, desperate people having to leave their country to go to another place. I know in the Middle East, whenever I bring up the issue of the situation of migrant laborers, often from educated people I get the standard answer, well, it's bad enough for them in India, or, you know, it's bad in Nepal. You should see how they live in Nepal or in India. Give us some insight into what it's like for people in Kyrgyzstan, in Tajikistan, etc., which in a way allows that steady stream of them to keep coming into Russia, even if they know the conditions are going to be bad in Russia.
Well, in fact, in fact, you don't really get much reporting about bad conditions in Russia and about violence based on xenophobia or nationalist feelings in Central Asia, because Central Asia is predominantly under the influence of the Russian media, Kremlin-controlled Russian media. But yeah, coming back to your question, Russia, Kazakhstan, and maybe a few other countries are sometimes the only option for people living in mostly rural areas, but also in urban areas as well, because there are no jobs, because these countries are very poor.
And they're highly reliant on remittances.
Yes, they highly, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, they highly rely on remittances, and one would argue that those remittances that constitute up to half the portion of GDP, they fulfill some functions of the state.
Okay, Erica, can I stop you for a second? We're going to continue this in the post-show because I want to get to Ahmed to look at some of the other stories that we're covering.
Yeah, we follow a lot of stories here, Erica. Sorry to cut you off. We just want to share with our audience and you that, you know, we're following the story of a blogger being decapitated for covering the Zetas cartel in Mexico. This is, I think, the third or fourth blogger in Nuevo Laredo who has prompted, you know, so people, activists on social media to unite against you know, the drug cartels. Now, we also saw, this is coming from Egypt, a female Salafist candidate by the name of Marwa Ibrahim al-Qamash has been using a photo of her husband on a poster. She first used a photo of a flower as her campaign, and now she's using her husband, which has prompted a lot of online ridicule. Now, of course, we know that Salafist women, many of whom try not to show their identity or their face in public society. The last story we're following is from Kenya. As you can see in this photo, there have been lecturers in public universities entering their second day of strikes. They're demanding higher pay. And even though the government sent a directive telling them to resume their duties, they have since refused to do so. This is, I think, they're entering their third day of protest. Now, for those of you at home, if you would like to follow these stories, you can vote them up. You can follow the link on the screen right here on our subreddit. Just want to say a quick thank you to our colleague Mitchell Williams, who's been with us for many months since the beginning of the stream. Just wanted to give a quick shout out to him. He's leaving us.
Yeah, good luck to Mitchell, going to perhaps brighter places. We don't know. Thanks, Erica, and thanks, Madeleine. We'll continue the discussion on the post-show, stream.aljazeera.com. On Monday, we look at resources issues affecting Haiti after the deadly earthquake. Stay with us, stream.aljazeera.com. Welcome back to the post-show, stream.aljazeera.com. As always, so much to say, so little time. Apologies for cutting you off. We need to get to that part so that we can understand what stories our viewers are interested in and get them to tell us a little bit about what they want us to cover. You were talking about remittances, you were talking about that sense of desperation and the economic issues that lead migrants to places like Russia. Mm-hmm. I'm going to allow you to expand on that point now.
Oh yes, well what I was saying is that Russia and some other countries, they sometimes are the only option for families to get by, to get some income because there are no jobs at home. By sending remittances, by sending so much, such big volumes of remittances, migrants in a way they fulfill some function of the state. You know, so they provide some welfare to the society, to their families that state is not able to provide. And very often, for instance, in the case of Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and sometimes in the case of Kyrgyzstan, we see how the ruling regimes are sort of free riding on this. You know, this delegated function. They kind of they don't want to do anything about it. They're okay having their citizens working in Russia and supporting families at home.
And also, perhaps to expand on this, Madeleine, if there's any reason to complain to Russia because one of these countries is deemed a weaker state, in need of not only the remittances, but perhaps in need of the political alliance with Moscow, do we find that the citizens are sacrificed along the way because of the bigger issues at play here?
I think it's certainly the case that a lot of issues that might in other respects be raised at intergovernmental meetings, or that might be, you know, that perhaps ought to be much more the source of domestic political commentary, aren't really talked about in Central Asian states at a political level because there are anxieties that of possible repercussions. All of the major sending states from Central Asia have a visa-free regime at present with Russia. And there's a great deal of anxiety that if Russia is antagonized too much, there's always the threat of imposing a visa regime. So I think that acts as a brake. I wonder if I could just respond to something
sure.
Erica said a moment ago, because I absolutely agree that amongst migrant workers, there isn't necessarily much kind of open complaining about conditions in Russia. I would agree at a political level, in terms of political organizing, most people that I've spoken to are just extremely grateful that they can go and work in Russia. And very often the attitude is, well, look, you know, at least I can work in Russia, and that's more than I'm able to do here. And thank goodness that the Russian, you know, government has provided the conditions within which I can get a job. But I think it's also fair to say that that experience of everyday, low-level racism, and I'm not talking about, you know, violent attacks, but the kind of sort of everyday encounters of condescension, the kind of hassle that people get from the police or from the Federal Migration Service because their documents aren't in order. I think that does feed a great deal of disillusion, and sometimes that bleeds into feelings of resentment towards Russians at home. And it's worth remembering that there are significant Russian minorities, certainly in Kyrgyzstan and in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, though they're smaller there. And I think it's fair to say that, you know, in Central Asian states, we've also seen a rise of nationalism. And I think, although the stories there are different, I think there's also a sense in which they feed into each other. That if you're treated really, really badly in Russia, and you come home and to your home country, and you have a sense that, well, here the Russians are treated really well. Hang on, what's this inequality?
Yeah, it does. You know? It does play with a power dynamic. No doubt.
Definitely.
I mean, those are other issues that are brought up. Just one of the tweets that came in from Aaron Haynes saying here at AJ Stream: stop disseminating negative messages, propaganda about migrant workers. I'm sorry, Aaron. I wish I could tell you the situation was rosy, but it's not. That's why we're doing the show, and we'll continue to do shows like this.
Well,
Ahmed?
to follow up on that tweet, you know, we have Sleepless in VA saying the problems of the migrant workers, he's just emphasizing a point that was made earlier by you, Imran, is not just a Russian one, but a global one. And he's citing one of our programs, Surprising Europe, which looks at immigration or immigrants in Europe. Now, Madeleine, if I could just throw to you this question, or rather a comment that came in from Facebook, from Larry Elisa. He writes, the Caucasus are vital for Russian security. If Moscow listens to the dissenting voices and adopts an anti-Muslim Caucasus policy, NATO and the West will be glad to fill the vacuum by handing out aid and planning an anti-missile shield right in Russia's backyard. I mean, there's a lot in there, jumbled up. I think maybe he's trying to highlight, you know, the idea that there's lots of value for the Russians in investing in the Caucasus. Otherwise, perhaps others will. What do you make of this?
Tricky one. I mean, I'm a social anthropologist rather than a political analyst who does geopolitics, and I'm always tend to be to verge on the side of skepticism when it comes to conspiracy theories about a grand, you know, destabilizing missions by either the West or Russia, it has to be said. I'm much more interested in the daily struggles of ordinary people. But I think it is certainly...
I was just going to say, well, maybe we could make it more simpler. Do you think Moscow, it's in their interest to listen to the dissenting voices, or let's just say the voices, even though we said they're not perhaps particularly vocal about complaining about their situation, but the migrant workers, for example?
I think absolutely, and I think in regard to the Caucasus, it's absolutely crucial that there is a stable and peaceful Caucasus, not just within Russia, but in the greater Caucasus region, that is vitally important, you know, for stability in the whole region. And I think a large part of that does entail really trying to understand, I think, the significance of the political economic dynamics that are leading migrant workers to come and work in Russia. But I think it also really means taking seriously what it means for Russia to be a multi-ethnic and multi-confessional state. We shouldn't forget that there is, you know, that there is a very large Muslim minority in Russia, not just in the North Caucasus, but in the Urals, and that I think there's still a real and ongoing and historically rooted tension between an idea of Russia as Россия, that is, as a state for all of its population, and Russia imagined as ultimately the homeland that is defined by and for the ethnic Russians. And that tension is not going to go away. And I think at the moment, the kind of scary sort of popularity of nationalist movements is that there isn't a kind of a political settlement, really.
Right. I honestly think that we need to dedicate an entirely different program to the North Caucasus, Chechnya, Dagestan, Ingushetia, etc. Although a lot of these themes do overlap here. Erica, before we say bye-bye to our online viewers, your final thoughts?
Oh, my final thoughts. It's very easy to use nationalism in any country by any movement, and the ruling regime, the ruling party in Russia tried to do that. And now the opposition is trying to unite people to challenge the ruling party at the elections next month, parliamentary elections. They might achieve some modest results because more people will be supporting the opposition and vote against the ruling party. But in the long term, I don't think it's going to bring anything positive.
So you're not too optimistic. Okay, thank you, Erica. Thanks a lot for joining us on the stream, as well as Madeleine Reeves. It's been a great pleasure hearing your thoughts. I hope both of you enjoyed the format, and I'm glad you took the time to share your thoughts with us. Hope to see you on the Orange Couch again in the not too distant future. Ahmed, thanks for that. Monday, we've got a show on Haiti. Look forward to that.
We do.
Thanks for watching. Stream.aljazeera.com. In a couple of hours' time, you can watch this entire program again online. That's when it will be posted at stream.aljazeera.com. See you Monday. Bye-bye.